Okay. First, I should mention a couple of things. One is, along with the usual words and maps handouts that you received from Laurie this week, there is a perhaps somewhat mysterious one on Teotihuacan, taking soundings in Teotihuacan, and that's primarily for those people in the course that may have done one or both of the Latin American Native people courses that we did earlier. It's from last week's issue of the Economist news magazine, and it's on the city, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, uh, the city of Teotihuacan, just north of what's Mexico City. That was the metropolis of one of the cultures that preceded the Aztecs. So it's an interesting article, and I thought people might be interested in it. Um, the other thing is that Laurie has received some people who say they're interested in getting a short reading list, short bibliography, with the last handouts for next week's class. And I will therefore put together a short bibliography and include that among the handouts. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off from last week. And that was with the native people of Virginia and the arrival of the Europeans, the Powhatan hegemony in Tidewater, Virginia. And we had noted that the British impact on the Indians of Virginia in that area were much slower than that of the Spanish in Peru, Mexico, or New Mexico for that matter. There were no marches of conquest, no long distance exploration and devastation, and of course, no cities to conquer. The English moved inland along the Tidewater estuaries very slowly as the number of settlers came along. I'm having trouble moving the, oh, there we are. Okay, there we are. The Tidewater estuaries, the rivers coming off the west side of Chesapeake Bay. So it was all a very gradual process. And then in 1618, Powhatan, who was already quite elderly, died, and his brother Opechancanough was now formally at the top of the heap, so to speak. And Opechancanough perceptibly recognized a menace in the now multiplying colonists. While many English and many Indians had thought that the post-1614 relative tranquility, the relative tranquility after the First Anglo-Powhatan War, was a good deal, Opechancanough knew better. Particularly after 1617, introduced the first great American economic boom when the colonists began shipping increasingly large and increasingly numerous shiploads of tobacco to England. Opechancanough could see what was going to happen. There were more and more settlers coming in, too many Brits turning up, immigration was increasing, and because of the tobacco boom, you no longer had to force people to come to Virginia at gunpoint. You now expected to come to make real money in Virginia, And some of the first generation tobacco farmers there in Virginia did very well indeed, became the FFVs, the first families of Virginia, the FFVs. So all of this worried Opechancanough, and in 1622, he and the Powhatan mounted a massive surprise attack, the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. It's what today we'd call a preventive war. He could see what was happening, he could see it was a real danger, and he damn well was going to try to do something about it. So, in 1622, a massive surprise attack on the colonists. At the time, in 1622, the colony's population was only a bit over 1,100 people, not all that many. And the attack killed some 400 to 500 of the colony's population. So you had a 40% or so death rate. Very bloody little war. The Powhatan enthusiasm for trying to stand up to the British was given a good deal of juicing by Nathaniel, a prophet. And I think it's worth pointing out that in most significant Native American wars against the Europeans, in many of them there was a prophet, a religious motivation involved. Some sort of spiritual leader who serves as the catalyst, the foundation for whatever Native American unity there is. We saw this before with Popé in the Pueblo revolt of 1680. We'll see it again. So in the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, Nathaniel may well have been as important as Opechancanough. Opechancanough has been the one who's had the press, and he was the one who did the military organizing and the leadership. But the spiritual impetus provided by a prophet always helps. It always helps to kick up a good deal of enthusiasm. So I think it's safe to say that Nathaniel set the psychological stage for Opechancanoug's military successes. They were military successes at first. Many of the settlers at the time trusted the indigenous people, but of course not for long. They counterattacked, the British counterattacked using allies from the Potomac tribe. Up here, this is the Potomac River, up here in what's now Northern Virginia. People who had no love for the Pamunkey, for the hegemony, the Powhatan hegemony. And this too, along with the frequent presence of a prophet, this was to become an old story in North America. Indian allies of Europeans against other Indians. At a peace meeting proposed by Opechancanough, one English negotiator poisoned 200 Indians with poison-laced wine. There was even a huge open field battle involving about 800 Indians and some 60 colonists. And the English, who by now were self-sufficient in foodstuffs, with food being grown on the local farms and plantations, the English began raiding the Powhatan cornfields to destroy the food supply wherever they could. In 1628, the two sides made a peace, but shortly afterwards, the Powhatans resumed hostilities. In 1629, an English attack on a major village hurt the Indians, and while there was no formal or even semi-formal peace negotiation, the war gradually ran down. Some of the native people moved inland a bit to get away from the British. In any case, by 1631, the Second Anglo-Powhatan War had pretty much faded away. In 1644, however, Opechancanough, saying that people were still coming in, they were still losing ground. In 1644, Opechancanough led another desperate attack on the colony as the English, growing more and more tobacco and larger plantations, began to expand inland. This time, the Powhatans were roundly and formally defeated. Opechancanough was captured and killed by the British, and a 1646 agreement resulted in tracts of land being set aside for the Indians, tracts that became the very first American Indian reservations. Today, you can see vestiges of that 1646 agreement in two small state reservations, Virginia state reservations, for the Pamunkey and for one other tribe. And annually, there was a little ceremony in the Virginia state capitol in Richmond when the residents of the reservations pay annual tribute to the governor of Virginia. So the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, 1644, resulted in the complete elimination, basically, of the Powhatan as a significant factor in Eastern Virginia. So very rapidly, they'd gone from being the dominant hegemony in the Virginia Tidewater to being a small, scattered on the western borders of the colony or on those reservations, small fragment of their former glory. Before we leave the Powhatan people, we should mention the first great Native American myth, popularized in various ways by endless stories and by the Disney Corporation in a film in 1995. Pocahontas has been one of the enduring images of American Indian people. There have been whole books written on the Pocahontas Mythos, and actually I'll include the one I've read on the bibliography. This is an 1855 artist's interpretation that you see on the screen now, done up glamorously, with flowers in her hair, faded wooded background, looking positively mid-19th century glamorous. She's had all sorts of images and made a fair bit of money in the 1990s for Disney. She's turned up around the world, including in China. When my wife Dana and I were teaching in China, we came across a child's picture book telling the story of Pocahontas. And here she is watching from a unrealistically steep hillside for that part of Virginia, watching the John Smith colonists come in, and here's John Smith bringing the ecstatic young Pocahontas some gifts. So there's a whole class we could put together, I suppose, on mythological, semi-mythological, legendary Native American characters and how they've been used and abused by the American and Canadian, and before that, the British colonial media and imagery. Before we go on any further, before we move on to the Beckons War, the Bacon Rebellion, any comments or questions on what we've done so far on the Powhatan? Laurie, would you briefly open it up? And if there are any...
Absolutely. Alan, Judy did type in the chat box, what did a battle between the Indians and British settlers look like in 1846?
In 1846?
That is what the question states, yes.
It doesn't mean 1646, does it?
Perhaps, Judy, can you unmute yourself and clarify?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Typo, 1646. You know, they were, you know, I don't know how many years before that, the Indians were, you know, winning. And then something happened and the British just slammed them to the ground. So Indians were working were fighting with what kind of weaponry, and the English with what? Can you describe that briefly?
Well, they had a lot of their traditional weaponry, the bow and arrow.
Okay.
But they also had a certain number of muskets. They had some firearms. And for better or for worse, European firearms have been one of the big popular trading items. So wherever the Europeans turned up, they traded, sometimes for food, sometimes for furs, weaponry, muskets at that time.
Wow. Okay.
There was a combination of the two, traditional weapons, primarily bows and arrows, so far as I know, and muskets.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Alan? Just remember to unmute yourself.
Alan, what is true about Pocahontas?
Well, there was a Pocahontas, and we don't really have time. If you're really interested in the Pocahontas mythology, I'd recommend reading the book that'll turn up on the bibliography. But she really was the daughter of, I believe it was Powhatan. She really did meet John Smith, and she was a very smart person. She picked up English. She could see that things were changing, and she ended up in England. She ended up in England. She died in England. She was quite a draw. In one sense, if you want to look ahead, you can look ahead to the 19th century and people like Buffalo Bill and the circuses of the day, which often had what they looked at on as tame Native American people. She was quite a draw. She was an exotic Native American, an exotic American Indian. And eventually she got sick and died in England. But she was a real person, and she was a good deal more sophisticated, let's say, and a good deal more perceptive, and in many ways a good deal more successful than either the Chinese or the Royals would would have her. She was not a glamorous mid-19th century vamp. She was not a naive little girl. Um, she seemed to have pretty much seen what the situation was and managed to use the British settlers somewhat to her advantage, to the dismay of the people that she left behind. No more than it was seen to be. Let me rephrase that. The British really hated to see any of their settlers going off to the Indians for a easier and more interesting life. And the native people also didn't much like to see native people, their tribes people, to a considerable extent going over to the Europeans, going over to the Brits. So she was a controversial character, both from a point of view, I think, of the Powhatan, the native people, and less controversial, more colorful, so far as the British were concerned. Okay, anything else?
Oh, Alan, I have a book by the Metophony people on Pocahontas, if anyone's interested in that. Her mother was Metophony and her father was Pamunkey. And so this is from the people and their story about her and her story and so on. It's called The True Story of Pocahontas. And if anybody's interested, I can get information to them on that.
Okay, anything else?
Okay, I'm going to put everybody else.
Okay. Okay, now let's look at the lead up to the Bacon's Rebellion and Nathaniel Bacon himself. First, a little background. Well, we've already been giving some background, but first, some post-1644 background. Now, throughout these years that we've been looking at, there were occasional flashes of the old philanthropic ideal of converting Indians to civilized British ways. The Virginia Company, which was behind the settlement, sent men, one a former MP, former member of Parliament, to Virginia in 1620 and 1621. They were preachers. They actively preached Christianity, Anglican, Episcopal Christianity, and preached English ways to the Powhatan, including setting up a college in Virginia, College for Indians. And this, of course, was seen as another very obvious threat by Opechancanough. The last thing he wanted was to have his people converted to the Christian religion, to the British ways. The Indians on the college were to work some 10,000 acres with 100 tenants, and we'll be talking a bit more about tenants shortly, to build up funds for the college. So the college was imagined to be somewhat self-supporting. But they got help in 1615 and 1617. Church of England, Anglican church parishes in England, took up collections to raise money for the college by order of the king, which helped setting up the college in the early 1620s. In 1619, the new treasurer of the Virginia Company received an anonymous donation of 500 pounds. Well, 500 pounds at that time would be, well, I don't know what in contemporary American dollars, but tens of thousands of dollars, probably more, to educate Indian children in English households. That is, to bring Indian kids to England for education there in English households. This is, by the way, is another harbinger of the future. In the 19th century, the American US government's Bureau of Indian Affairs pushed the idea of sending Native kids away from home to work and learn in white households. So much of what we can see in the 19th and 20th centuries in the United States, you can see pilot projects, so to speak, foreshadowings here in the 17th century. In any case, however, the Second Anglo-Powhatan War ended in any faint possibility of the idea of setting up an Indian college and shipping Indian kids to England. And then after 1646, after the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, the Indians of the old Powhatan hegemony were definitely tributary to the British. But to the British, Indians further to the west, like the Susquehanna, were seen as new threats, with the quiet tribes, fragments really of the old Powhatan hegemony, seen as irrelevant or as possible allies against hostile Native people of the new further west frontier. Okay, we'll spend some time now on the mid-17th century social and economic situation in Virginia that set the pattern for much of the economics and many of the social attitudes that characterized British, American, and Canadian relations in subsequent years. Then we'll talk a bit about Bacon's Rebellion, and then move on to New England, as the religious and intellectual mindset of the New Englanders was also important in setting the pattern for American ideology and first British, then American Native relations right into the 21st century, right up to the present. Okay. In Virginia, after the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, land engrossing became very fashionable for those who could afford it. Today we'd call it land speculation. Land at first was cheap and easy to buy from the Virginia Company, which had moved to assert its claims to a lot of land after the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. I mean, after all, these wars, from the point of view of the British, were just wars, and part of the rationale for the way you treat people after a just war is you can push them to one side if they don't wish to be encompassed by your culture. So people with the wherewithal, usually the first settlers, the first people who had begun to cash in on the tobacco boom, began to buy up huge tracts from the Virginia Company. Then new people coming in from Britain to cash in on tobacco prosperity had two choices. They could rent from a landlord, or they could become tenant farmers, not own the land, but be tenant farmers, or they could trek further and further west to the frontier to find cheap or free land. What this meant was, and again, this is characteristic of the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries as well, the Europeans were moving more quickly to the west than the actual population density back east would logically encourage. So what they did was they created a thinly populated and restless frontier, and this guaranteed permanent friction with the Native Americans on that frontier. In the proverbial nutshell, this set the pattern for European native frontier relations in the British colonies that became the United States. Settlers moved west, often against the wishes of the government, and then demand protection from that government, either through the militia or through regular army troops, once they're there. So keep this in mind. We'll be saying this again and again. Ambitious, land-hungry settlers move west, settle a thinly populated frontier, often even though they've been discouraged or even forbidden from doing so by the government. And when they get there, they begin to demand protection. Okay, who are these immigrants? Most immigration to Virginia after the tobacco era began in 1617 were indentured servants who, if they lived, were eventually released as freedmen after 7 years or so. Once they were released after their 7-year indentureship, they were free to seek their fortune in the weed, in the tobacco market. Well, at first, many didn't live. Until about 1650, the mortality rate among whites in Virginia was terrific, even by 17th century standards. Mortality rate of about 15% to 25% per annum. So if you're a new immigrant to Tidewater, Virginia in these years, you've got up to a 25% chance of dying very quickly. We're not sure why. Possibly because most who came as indentured servants weren't particularly healthy in the first place. And then they were then put to hard work in an unfamiliar, much warmer climate. Typhoid fever also seems to have been a medical problem in Virginia. Okay, indentured servants dying in large numbers in their first year formed the bulk of the mid-17th century labor force, along with white freedmen, former indentured servants, who couldn't afford an indentured servant or a black slave or a mem of their own. Because yes, there were also slaves. Sometimes these slaves were Indians. If you fight a just war against someone and they lose, you're entitled to take some of them as slaves. And this was the traditional route to slavery in Europe. Capture and war or criminal sentence. Powhatan people taken during the 1622 and 1644 wars, the Second and Third Anglo-Powhatan Wars, qualified nicely for the captive in wars category. Many were enslaved and shipped to the Carolina colony, which came along after Virginia. And as if you've kept up with the media, we know there was a beginning to be a trickle of African slaves coming in from West Africa in the first half of the century, invariably as slaves. West Africans were brought in from outside, from Africa, obviously, but Indians taken as slaves were usually sold outside the colony, sometimes to Carolina, sometimes to Barbados or other British islands in the Caribbean. And it's an important principle of the slave business. You have to get slaves away from their home neighborhood. Locals make lousy slaves. They know the neighborhood. They usually succeed in running away, which many of them managed anyway, particularly in the Caribbean islands, but that's another story. Okay, until the last quarter of the 17th century, until after 1675-76, the situation in Virginia was fluid. Virginia, the colony, hadn't settled into a slave economy of the sort that became so painfully familiar later. White indentured servants and slaves, to many people, were not all that different. There were a number of freed slaves in the population, and apparently some black indentured servants. But then, what seems to have happened by the 1670s, 1660s, 1670s, was that lower class whites' hostility towards the upper class, the land engrossing first families of Virginia, turned towards the Indians and the blacks as scapegoats. The native people, the Indians, died out or moved west, so West African slaves were moved in their place as a workforce. A couple of reasons for this. Until the death rate of both blacks and whites improved after 1650, and again, it's unclear as to why this was, but after the middle of the century, death rates improved. Whether you were a slave from West Africa or an indentured servant coming in from the UK, your chances of living were a bit better. So after 1650, your chances of living were a bit better. But until 1650, it had been more economic to buy an indentured servant than to buy a slave. It was more expensive to import slaves from West Africa than it was to simply pay the passage of an indentured servant from England or Scotland or Wales, and then have him work for you for 7 years, paying off his transportation, and then import another one. But after mid-century, this economic calculation changed. It became cheaper to import a slave because they were apt to live longer. And slaves, after all, are slaves for life in most cases, unless they find some way to be freed or unless they run away. So you've got labor for life rather than for just 7 years. It's also worth mentioning that as land prices rose, the FFVs, the first families of Virginia, tried to keep land prices as high as they could. And as the reputation of Virginia and England became at best spotty after the first burst of enthusiasm for the tobacco business, when mortality rates were still quite high, it became harder to get British men to indenture themselves to Virginia What, you want me to go there? Die? And then in 1676, an important year, 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, named after Nathaniel Bacon, revealed the explosive tensions that had built up in Virginia society. Putting it mildly, freed white indentured servants were angry at the land engrossing and political control of the wealthy first families of Virginia, who were tightening up their political and economic control. The Virginia Assembly passed a law as of 1670. Only landowners and householders could vote. So unless you own your own home or own land, you couldn't vote. Before 1670, just about everyone could vote. And there was Indian trouble on the frontier. The native people further west retaliated as British settlers moved into their lands. As I've mentioned, the only way to get away from the FFVs, from the land speculators, was to move west. And there were native people there. Okay, the governor was a man named William Berkeley. And Governor Berkeley tried to keep the settlers from moving west. He knew that there would be trouble, frontier trouble with the native people, but he had little real control. The British Army didn't have any presence in Virginia. The militia was locally controlled. And news of Metacom's war, we'll get to that next week, news of Metacom's war in New England had the Virginia frontier on edge. They'd heard about a significant Indian war in the New England colonies, and they were nervous. And since the 1622 and 1644 attacks, the Virginia settlers were always aware of the possibility of an Indian attack. Well, in July of 1675, a group of Dogue Indians grabbed some hogs of one Thomas Matthew, saying that he owed them for some goods that they provided. Well, Matthew disagreed, and his men attacked the Dogue natives, got the hogs back, and killed or beat several Dogues. They in turn hit back, killed one of Matthew's indentured servants. The Westmoreland County, by now they had established several counties, the Westmoreland County militia attacked the Dogues, then asked them for a conference. At the conference, they attacked and killed a chief and 10 men. In another militia attack, another militia action by the Westmoreland County militia, they attacked and killed 14 friendly Susquehanna Indians before they discovered their error. The old adage, all Indians look alike. Well, apparently that's what the Westmoreland County militia thought. Not surprisingly, the Susquehannas retaliated, and a full-scale war began. Governor Berkeley refused to commission Nathaniel Bacon, this man, as an officer in the militia. He was a bit nervous about what he thought Bacon might want, because Bacon had promised to basically wipe out all Indians. The governor said, no, only go after the hostile Indians. Well, Bacon, who was a frontiersman, done up, well-educated man, but a frontiersman, well-dressed, well-educated, but he could see where the frontier sympathies lay. Bacon and most frontiersmen were determined to clear the area of Indians. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. Berkeley, the governor, was afraid of an expensive war. They'd be annoyed with him in Britain if he asked for troops. This all costs money. And he was also afraid, frankly, of losing control of the colony to these lowlifes like the frontiers people. And here's another not invariable principle, but common principle. The more distant your government is and the less popular control behind it, the more likely it is to protect the rights of minorities. The more distant your government is and the less popular control behind it, the more likely it is to protect the rights of minorities. This is not invariable, but we can see in history that it's often happened. We've already mentioned that the Crown, the British government, had ordered parishes to collect money for educating Native people in Virginia. Governor Berkeley, who was the governor appointed by the British government, was a bit more sensitive to the needs of the Native people, largely through his own interests, of course, but nevertheless, a bit more concerned with the problems of the Native people than the frontiers people were. What changes the people in the Latin American Native people class will remember this. What favorable changes protecting the indigenous people in Latin America didn't come from the local Spanish settlers, but royal laws from the King of Spain. Another example going far afield, in India in the 1880s, the British government decided that it was okay for British people in India to be tried by local native judges. This was not well received in India. And here in the United States, the federal government has certainly been the most distant level, a large overpowering level, but also by and large has been most active in civil rights. Federal judges are beyond anyone's control, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, they were the most solicitous after both Native American and African American civil rights. So it's probably easier to be just at a distance away from democratic control. Well, back to Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon organized militias and turned on Berkeley, and basically civil war, Bacon's rebellion, broke out. The indigenous people were partly forgotten. Eventually, Governor Berkeley won. He won, but in the aftermath, having seen what happened, the British government intervened to improve the lot of the poor white smallholders. They wanted to avoid unrest. They wanted to keep the flow of tobacco coming in. After all, for the government, there was good money in the tobacco taxes. So the result of Bacon's rebellion, other than Bacon was executed, but the larger result of Bacon's rebellion was that the lot of poor whites improved. African Americans were forced into an increasingly rigid system of chattel slavery, and indigenous people were now on the way out in eastern and into central Virginia. By 1675, Native people were the least significant element in the Virginia population. They were expendable. At the start of the century, they had been the most significant element. Okay, so again, emphasizing in the generation after Bacon's rebellion, poll taxes were cut, benefits in kind, tools, or land, provided to the freed white indentured servants were increased. The British government insisted that they get 50 acres of land at the end of their 7-year indentureship. So by and large, conditions for the poor whites improved. And what had begun as a frontier war against Indians became a rebellion by poor whites against the FFVs, the first families of Virginia, went on to become a rebellion of poor whites against the local aristocracy. The British back in the UK were very mindful of the dangers of civil wars. It was only a few years earlier that the civil wars in England had erupted, resulting in the execution of the king, Oliver Cromwell in the Commonwealth period, a overweening standing army. So they were very mindful of the danger of rebellion by the people, only a few years after the English Civil Wars. Okay, later as the years went by, blacks continued to lose humanity in the eyes of Virginia whites, and even lower class poor whites came to seem at least acceptable to the FFVs, the first families of Virginia, and the royal officials running the colony. The FFVs who had despised the poor whites probably didn't stop despising them, but did recognize them as a great danger if they were abused too brutally, and increasingly recognized the poor whites as allies against the growing population of slaves on whom the prosperity of the colony with its ever larger tobacco plantations increasingly depended. In short, the economic elite and political elite in Virginia was scared by Bacon's rebellion by the lower class whites and saw another rising by them as a greater danger than that of a slave, or certainly an Indian rising. The poor whites were given just enough to keep them quiet and were encouraged to look down on blacks and indigenous people. And there's nothing like a class of people lower than you on the social scale to keep you feeling good about yourself. So during the colonial period, while there were many slave uprisings, all were on a small scale until the 19th century, but in the colonial period, all were on a small scale. No white Virginian lost his or her life. But the colonial government and the first families of Virginia remembered Bacon's rebellion for a long time. Okay, let's take a quick break for questions now before we move from Virginia and up to New England, and from there, if we have time, into the St. Lawrence Valley of Canada. So, Laurie, if you could open it up for questions.
Absolutely. Remember, you can unmute yourself or you can type a question in the chat box.
What, no questions? You accept
So
everything?
Alan, during this time, the native peoples were just getting pushed further and further west, besides those little reservations they set up?
Well, yeah, a minority of the uh, local native people who were on those reservations, a lot of them just moved west.
Okay. And were they then displacing other people as they moved west?
They didn't have the strength of the power to displace other people. What they tried to do was find find refuge with, say, the Susquehanna or other people to the west. And adoption, the adoption of friendly people from friendly neighboring tribes was a characteristic of many Native American people. And if you were a refugee, or if you and your family were just trying to get away as refugees, move to a better countryside where you had an opportunity to live your life as you wanted to leave it with, well, people like you, the chances of being taken on were pretty good. After all, some of these tribes people, the Susquehannas and others to the west, they had health problems with the European diseases coming in. Their populations were certainly not growing, so they were often inclined to take on people who are culturally very similar to them, even if they'd been off again, on again hostile at some time, to increase their populations for both horticulture and for warfare.
I, Alan, was fascinated by this part of your presentation, and particularly kind of the background on the social layers and strata that we experience in present day United States. The poor whites who are, looking for somebody to, look beneath them, the very wealthy upper classes who are trying to maintain control and have such a distance. And of course, that begs the question of the middle class, and I don't know where that is, but it's really, it was very interesting to me to kind of see that, we were a new country, so it all had to begin again, and your descriptions is kind of like what happened when it began again. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't think it takes long, very many generations for local aristocracy to emerge. And that's certainly what happened in Virginia with the FFVs. And of course it happened, it took a little longer in New England, as we'll see, but heaven knows there are an awful lot of people around who claim one way or another to be able to trace their ancestry to the Mayflower or the Daughters of the American Revolution and so on. It's a prestige point. Thank you. Okay, one other point. I haven't mentioned women, British women coming, and it is certainly true that you had more British women coming to Virginia than you had Spanish women coming to Latin America. And those of you who did the Latin American classes will remember I emphasized that very few Spanish women came to Mexico or Peru. But they were able to prevail on English, Scottish, and Welsh and Irish women to now and again, well, more often than now and again, to come to Virginia, particularly as prosperity increased. There was a pretty fair chance of finding a husband there. So, okay, anything else? Okay, let's get away from the tidewater now and look at the larger European arrival in North America pattern for a bit. We've seen the English coming well up and into Chesapeake Bay, encountering the Powhatan. Towards the top of Chesapeake Bay, they began encountering the Delaware. I've also mentioned that Carolina colony appeared in the 17th century south of Virginia. Up here in the north, you had the English, the Brits, coming in. You'll notice there's a tantalizingly thick line coming into Hudson's Bay. This was not a colony of settlement, but the initial British settlements in what's now Canada, they came for two different reasons. One was fur trading. Small number of fur traders equipped with British technology, dealing with the Chipewans, the Cree, and so on, Hudson's and James Bay. And this small arrow coming down to Newfoundland, and it might have shown, it didn't, going down to Nova Scotia and the coast of New England for fishing, the cod fisheries. And then we have the French, we'll be getting to them later, coming up the St. Lawrence Valley and then moving into the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi Valley and west into Assiniboine country. Okay, so the Europeans arrived in North America. Oh, and of course we have the Spanish coming up here from the south, and later the Russians coming down into what for a time was Russian Alaska. Well, okay, we might pause briefly to ask if all of this discussion about slavery, West Africans, was getting away from indigenous people, but not really. Keep in mind that as many later colonial Americans came to view Africans as less than human, it became easier to see Indians less than human too, and easier to kill them or enslave them accordingly. In the South, what became the South of the United States, this attitude had specific repercussions 150 years later, most notably with the Cherokee and the other so-called 5 civilized tribes. But the principle, I think, applied across the board in frontiers from Pennsylvania and Kentucky to California and in between. Okay, now Virginia has been one colonial case study, with finishing up with a focus on Bacon's Rebellion. Second case study is New England. A quite different story in many ways, the English coming into New England. In Virginia, the theorists in England were talked about wanting to build an integrated Indian society on Anglo-Christian ground, never left England. And the people who did go to Virginia didn't have their vision, putting it mildly. In New England, the intellectual leaders of the colony went as political and administrative leaders, but they went for entirely different reasons from those of the theorists behind the immigrants to Virginia. The result in the long run for the New England indigenous people was pretty much the same. But it's interesting to see how this came about and how the course of things in New England was a bit different. Okay, in New England, the dominant group came to build what they called a city upon a hill for the entire world to emulate. This dominant group was the famous Puritans, beginning with the legendary Pilgrims to Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, followed by the more massive immigration to the Boston area beginning in 1630. So you had a much small coming into Plymouth, 1620, and then a much larger and better organized immigration to Massachusetts Bay, Boston, beginning in 1630. And there are significant theological differences between the Pilgrims and the Boston Puritans, but you'll be relieved to learn that we're not getting into those here. They were both Puritans. They were both interested in purifying the Protestant religion. There were also a lot of strangers, what the Puritans called strangers, coming with this British English initially, in migration, coming into New England. A lot of the fishermen and whalers who had come in Newfoundland, coast of Fundy, down here on the coast of New Hampshire. This was good fishing country. The local native people were anxious to trade, good fishing, good trading country. They didn't perceive the fishermen and the traders who came along as particularly threatening. Parenthetically, we can add that it's even possible that you may have had fishermen from English ports like Bristol coming to Newfoundland before Columbus, but that's another story. Okay, so there were lots of fishermen, strangers, whalers dropping by and trading with the native people, beginning at the latest in New England around 1530. So you had people coming from Britain to New England as early as 1530, but they weren't settlers. They were whalers, fishermen, occasional traders. Chances are you could combine the two. Fish, set up codfish drying and smoking stations on shore, trade with the local people, then head back to Bristol with a good profit. Okay, but beginning in 1630, that dominant bunch of immigrants was the Puritans. And they came to apply religiously inspired organization to civil government. They left England and arrived in America after the Pilgrims arrived after an interlude in Holland. The Puritans, most of them came directly from England to build a pure religious and civil society in what they saw as a new world. And this was the primary, I don't think we could say the only, but the primary aim of the first Puritan generation in America. And as it had in Latin America with the Spanish, it seemed to them that God was on their side. An epidemic, possibly smallpox, possibly something else, had decimated the local band of Indians in the Plymouth area in 1616. But before they died or fled, they turned up their fields for the spring planting. And the fields were still there, somewhat overgrown, but cleared. 4 years later, the Pilgrims arrived to find handy fields waiting. They were met by one of the native people who has had his name in elementary school history books for generations, Samoset. Samoset, a sachem of Indian people in Maine, up in Maine. More on sachems shortly. Samoset had known Englishmen through those fishing expeditions and fish drying and smoking bases that I mentioned. He'd picked up some English, apparently got on well enough with them. Okay, so Samoset spoke some broken English, and he told the Pilgrims of an Indian who had been in England, and all the way over to England, who spoke better English, but he also told them about the sachem of the regional tribe, the Wampanoags. Wampanoag meaning Eastern people, people living toward the sunrise. So let's look briefly at this picture, this slide. The Wampanoags in southeastern Massachusetts, what became Massachusetts, not including the Nauset, who were out here in Cape Cod. The Massachusetts people, and then further to the west, the Nipmuc here in central Massachusetts, Pennacook up in what's now New Hampshire, Western Abenaki, most of the Abenaki were up in Maine, into Nova Scotia, and down here around what's now Narragansett Bay, the Narragansett people of Rhode Island, what became Rhode Island and Connecticut. Okay, Massasoit. Massasoit was one of the two people that Samoset told the Pilgrims about. The other was another guy who got his name in the elementary school history books, Tisquantum, or Squanto. Tisquantum, Squanto, was one of the few, maybe the only survivors of a band of Wampanoag who had been hit by that epidemic, the 1614 epidemic. But before the epidemic in 1614 to 1616, he'd been, Squantum had been captured by a passing English ship and kidnapped. Oh, I should stop here and mention that this statue of Massasoit is right down here on the eastern end of the plaza in Kansas City. I haven't been by there for a number of years, but so far as I know, it's still there. Massasoit, and I'm not sure what the history of the statue was, but Massasoit is a statue right here in Kansas City. Okay. Tisquantum had been kidnapped by a passing English ship. He managed to escape the ship. The crew apparently intended to sell him into slavery in Spain. He got to England, lived in England for a while, then was hired onto a ship doing exploration along the coasts of northern New England and Newfoundland. When he got ashore, he jumped ship and made his way home. Worth noting parenthetically that beginning in the years after Columbus, there was quite an international community of mariners. And if you were a Black, if you were a Native American, if you were from India, it didn't matter where you were, as long as you could do your job aboard ship, As long as you had some training, you could possibly get hired on for the dangerous but important job of being a ship crew member. Okay, as the old Thanksgiving story goes, Tusquantum did provide tremendous aid to the English settlers at Plymouth. He showed them how to raise corn, how to fish, and showed how to live in the country. Unlike the English in Virginia, the English who came to Plymouth and later to Boston, to Massachusetts Bay, learned and worked. They had a considerable work ethic. And after their first harsh winter, they arrived in November, the Plymouth Pilgrims thrived in a modest way. So again, you can understand a belief in divine favor, such as the Spanish had when they arrived in the West Indies and Central America. Friendly Indians waiting, in the case of the Plymouth colony people, a friendly Indian who would show them how to live comfortably on the land. The Puritans who arrived in the Boston area in the years after 1630 and later, recognized Providence working in their favor too. They had a much larger, better organized expedition than the Plymouth Pilgrims had had. But again, the local Indians, the Massachusetts tribe, obviously the source of the name Massachusetts, had been decimated by an epidemic, leaving them vacant land. Okay, it's getting close to closing time. And before we get into the details, the important details of the Wampanoag people, the remnants of the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag people, and their way of life and their interactions, let's pause it for some questions and comments, and drop the class there. And Lori, if you could open up for questions.
Absolutely. Remember, you can unmute yourself. And if you have trouble doing that, you can send me a chat message and I will be happy to assist you. Anyone have questions for Alan before we end?
Okay, I'll mention here, because I don't know that I have it in my notes, but as was the case in Virginia, or only more so, women came to the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies. People often came as family groups, men, women, and children. That was the intention of the organizers. And initially it worked out really pretty well. So from the very beginning in the New England colonies, you had family groups and you had women taking an active part in the settlement arrangement.
Alan,
Yeah,
were
Craig.
women more free in these settlements than they had been in England?
Oh, I don't really know. Several women became involved in powerful theological debates. Anne Hutchinson and the Antinomian controversy being the most vivid. But by and large, the Puritan leaders, I think, had pretty much as strong of an emphasis on the political and economic subordination of women as they had back in England. Now, once you get out away from settlements and you're off on a farm, larger farm, further away from settlements than the farms in England will likely be, the women, I think, certainly did develop a greater sense of their importance to the family group and the amount of labor they had to put in. But I don't really know. Is anyone else qualified to speak to that? I'm not.
I can mention somebody I know who was a professor at the University of Alaska, but got her PhD at Brandeis. And her special interest was the women's status, the status of women during this time and beyond. And her name is June Namias, Namias, if anybody would like to do a little research on that. And I can't recall right off the top of my head some of her books, but she dealt with that quite a bit, the status of women, and also the fact that women captured by native peoples, and then when they attempted to rescue them, a lot of times they didn't want to go back. So
Yeah, we'll be getting into the captivity narratives. People, women, and sometimes men ending up being captured and not wanting to go back. Gil, could you spell her last name again?
yes, it's Namias. And she went to Harvard and then went up to Brandeis for a PhD.
Okay.
And
Okay.
she's from Cambridge, Massachusetts there.
I know it well. Okay, very good.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions or comments?
Okay, well, I will see, or at least hear, you all next week then for a final class. The only thing I can say with certainty about it is we won't get as far as I thought we might at the beginning of the